What is going on, my wonderful human geography? Well, geographers. That was the worst introduction ever. But on our last video lecture of the year, Mr. M is going to be reviewing all of the units that we have covered throughout the year, kind of one final review blitz. Let's hope that you get the time to go through these, because my goodness, are there a lot of models. Now we're going to start with, technically, goodness gracious, this should be, if anything, Unit 3, because of course Unit 3 is the culture unit. We're going to start with language dispersal theories. Remember, we're asking ourselves, as we research the largest language family, the Indo-Europeans, we try to go back and identify why this language family is so massive, where they originally started, I guess you could say, where they originated. What was the hearth of the Indo-European language? And we call that language the Proto-Indo-European language, wherever it developed, wherever it started. That's the language by which all of the Indo-European family eventually evolved. Anyways, there are two primary theories for this. The first is known as the Kurgan theory, if you remember, sometimes just referred to as the conquest theory or the Kurgan conquest theory. There was idea that the Indo-European language probably developed down here in this area of Eastern Europe, right on the border of Eurasia, and that it was started by a group of horsemen in the Ukraine-Russia area known as the Kurgan hordes. And they became masters of horseback. Of course, horses were domesticated in Central Asia, so it makes sense. And, of course, what they did then is they proceeded to expand in all directions outward, and they brought their language with them. As they conquered new territory, they brought their language with them, and that became the dominant language in all the areas where they eventually conquered. Now, eventually, they were defeated. Went down, I guess you could say, and were replaced by other groups. But that legacy, that language that they had spread through conquest, is possibly where the Indo-European family originated. This is the other one. It has nothing to do with conquest. It's developed by a guy named Colin Renfrew. And what Renfrew basically said was, no. There was no conquest here. He believes it actually happened maybe a little bit earlier. That it was agriculture that actually helped to spread the Indo-European language. He believes there was probably, it's called the Anatolian hearth theory, by the way, that there was probably an area in modern-day Turkey where agriculture probably developed or originated, kind of in that Fertile Crescent area. And he speculated that as these agricultural practices spread, so did the language with which these agricultural practices had been developed. So since the Anatolians were the first to develop it, all the agricultural language was in their language, and eventually their language became the dominant language of everybody that picked up those agricultural practices around them. And that's what caused it to spread. Again, those are the two primary thoughts here. Again, we know that it diffuses outward from this area. Quite frankly, whether you're the Kurgan theory or the Anatolian hearth theory, they're both very, very close to one another. So ultimately, we know it started in this area. We're not sure which of the reasons why, and then we know it just expands massively, not only eastward towards Iran and India, but westward into Europe as well. Anyways, those are the two competing theories. And again, Colin Renfrew was the one who really argued that perhaps it was agriculture that was responsible. It's known as the Anatolian hearth theory, where agriculture, he thinks, first developed. Of course, the Kurgan theory by Maria Gimbutas argues that it was conquest by horsemen who brought their language with them. Next up, we switch, I guess we go back, I guess you could say, to Unit 3. I don't know what's up with these units, but they're all jacked up on this PowerPoint. Anyways, we got two theories when it comes to culture and the environment. The first is environmental determinism. Remember, this was the dominant theory throughout, up until I'd say probably the early 1900s. Remember, this is that the environment completely forms, shapes, and controls a culture. That all of a culture's behavior, their lifestyle, is really predicated and based off of the climate in which they live. And so the environment or the climate, and really the environment as a whole, is the dominant factor that affects us as a culture and how we evolve. This was kind of a racist theory, if only because a lot of the people that believed in environmental determinism believed there was actually certain climates that were better than others, that led to greater progress and productivity. Usually those were the climates in temperate regions. Not surprisingly, where environmental determinism was developed. It was trying to explain why Europe and other places were more developed, and early geographers believed maybe it had to do with the environment and the climate. It was perfect conditions for innovation, for new ideas, for progress. Warmer climates, they speculated, kind of were too hot, made people kind of lazy, less inclined to develop new innovations. Colder climates, too extreme, too severe. You're battling to fight for survival. We now reject environmental determinism as too narrow, and we've accepted something called possibilism instead. It's the belief that the environment is just one of many different factors that can affect how a culture develops or evolves. So the environment or the climate's one of them, but there are other factors as well. Maybe their history, right? Maybe the level of technology that they have, for instance, maybe their political system. All of these could be factors that also influence the evolution of a culture. All right. We're moving over to the demographic transition model, and as you can see, I'm changing the units as I go. Demographic transition is so vital. You must know it. It's developed by Warren Thompson, 1929. That's less important. Remember, the idea here is that there is a link, a correlation between industrialization and population growth. That as you industrialize, changes happen to your population, and as you develop throughout the transition, your population eventually stabilizes, and sometimes, eventually, may actually go negative again. Remember, Warren Thompson says, in stage one, right, stage one countries, those are high stationary, right? Lots of births, lots of deaths. They're kind of canceling each other out. You have a high death rate. You have a high birth rate. You need the births to replace the people that are dying. Life expectancy is low. You don't have any industry. This is a pre-industrialized society. No medicine, no modern medicine, none of those things. Pandemics, epidemics, all these problems. People live a short amount of time. And so you simply have a lot of people in order to offset the high death rate. Then as you industrialize, you move into stage two, right? This would be the stage two area right here. Death rates start to decrease. Why? Because you develop new medical technology, I guess you could say, innovations like medicines, pesticides, good Lord, medicine, antibiotics, vaccines that cause the death rate to go way down. Now, birth rate still remains high because the medicine brings down the death rate, but people's behavior takes longer to change. It takes generations for people to decide to have less children. So during stage two, your birth rate still is remaining high. Your death rate starts to decrease. This is known as a high expanding or an early expanding population, because you're going to have a lot of growth. Your population pyramid going to have a wide base and a narrow top. Stage three is where a country that continues to industrialize moves into. This is finally where you start to see birth rates come down. In stage three, you start to see a gradual decrease in birth rates. And as that happens, your population is still growing, but it's growing at a much slower rate. All right, and eventually you're going to make your way, as you further industrialize and become a fully industrialized mass consumption economy. You reach stage four. Stage four, remember, is that birth rates and death rates are both low now. They kind of almost cancel each other out. Maybe birth rates are higher by just a little bit. So you have a low growth or a slow growth setup. Now, hey, when he created the theory, there were only 4 stages. Since then, geographers have added the 5th, the declining stage. That is where your death rates are actually now exceeding your birth rates because people are having less and less kids voluntarily. Anytime your TFR, your total fertility, is 2.1 or lower, then you're on the way to a declining population if you're not already there. Again, as the country industrializes, the population stabilizes. Death rates, right? Birth rates. On the same map, or on the same chart, I should say, that is your rate of increase, right, of your population, or I should say your population as a whole. It's low here. It's going up massively during stage 2. It's going up more slowly, stage 3. It's going to barely increase stage 4, and then if you hit stage 5, it's going back down. This is a lovely little chart right here that kind of explains each of the 5 stages. I can't say anything else other than you absolutely must know this, all right? If you don't know this, then you're at a huge disadvantage on Friday. Obviously, native tribes, maybe in the Amazon, would be stage 1. Really low developing countries like Kenya, Afghanistan, 2. More rapidly developing countries, Brazil and China, would be stage 3, for instance. The UK, the US, stage 4. And then remember, Japan, Italy, Germany are actually in stage 5. The U.S. might be, if not, we would actually maybe have a declining population if not for migration. This is an awesome little chart here. Again, it shows you the stages. I love this because it tells you the why, all right? What I mean there is, why are birth rates high in stage 1? Because you don't have family planning. You have a high IMR. And most of your workers are in agriculture, so therefore you have a lot of kids because those are agricultural assets for the family. Why do you have the high death rates in stage 1? Lots of disease, lots of famine, no clean water or sanitation. You don't have those systems in place. You don't have a healthcare system. There may be lots of wars constantly and a general lack of education as well. Stage 2, death rates are falling. Why? Because you have improved healthcare. For instance, you develop new vaccines, maybe improved hygiene. You boil your water to eliminate some of the contaminants. Maybe you develop a sanitation system like they do in early industrialized countries for the first time. Maybe food production and storage is improved, so you don't have much wasted or spoiled food that's being consumed. You're able to transport goods more readily, quicker, more efficiently, and of course that is going to boost your health rates as well. Also, those medicines, vaccines, sorts of deals give you that decreased IMR. Stage 3, birth rates start to fall. Again, family planning becomes more widely available, contraceptives especially. Lower IMRs even further decrease. You have more mechanization. That means less need for workers, so there's less need for families to have as many kids. You have higher standards of living, and so you want generally less kids in order to give them a higher standard of living with the money that you do have. And women's status changes. As women's status changes, obviously, we're going to see less kids being born as they are delaying pregnancy, childbirth, with education, jobs, and other career choices. Stage 4, more of what you have already seen in stage 3. And then, of course, stage 5 is where the situation comes to be almost a negative. It is a negative. You're not even replacing yourself any longer. Laws of migration, well, we got to go to old Ernst Ravenstein. Now, the beauty of Ravenstein and his migration laws is that they're from 1885, and yet most of them still apply today. Every migration flow has a return migration flow. What we mean by that is between every 2 cities that exist, if there is a flow of migrants in one direction, there's going to be a counterflow back to that city as well. They're not going to be even. Right? There's a lot more people probably coming from, Mexico City to Los Angeles than from Los Angeles to Mexico City. But there's always that counterflow. You are seeing people return to their home area from the destination source. Next law, he says, is a majority of migrants move a short distance. All things considered, if they have a choice, they're going to move a shorter distance. Obviously, we prefer short distances to longer ones. Next law is that if they do move longer distances, they tend to choose big city locations. So, for instance, if they are, coming into the United States from another country, they're more likely to settle in Los Angeles, San Francisco, or another large city than they are a small town that has less opportunity for them. Urban residents are less migratory than those in rural areas. What we mean there is if you live in a rural area, you're more likely to migrate. If you already live in a city, you're less likely to migrate to another one because you already are in a city that probably has more opportunities than your last place. Also, families are less likely to make moves, international moves especially, than young adults. So what he's saying is most migrants that move internationally are young men trying to make a living so that they can then acquire a family. We don't normally see families making that journey. Now, of all of his theories, This is generally considered to be the least accurate. Today, for instance, in the United States, women, migrants into the United States, are almost even to men. And increasingly, we're seeing more women bringing children with them as well. So while this is still true, it is much less true than it was previously. Other laws, well, you need to know the gravity model. Remember, the gravity model is a measure of the interaction between two places, and it's used to predict the movement of people. What it is migration is inversely related to the distance traveled, and it's directly related or proportional to the population. So what we're saying here is, hey, the shorter the distance between two objects and the greater the mass or the population of those two places, the greater the pull that exists between them. All right, so again, there's going to be more migration to a place if the migrants have to travel a shorter distance. There's going to be more migration to large cities than there are to smaller ones. And so obviously, I think you can see how the gravity model very much coincides with Ravenstein's laws. So in this particular model, I would suspect that even though the distance is a little further away between these two cities, there's going to be a greater connection, a greater pull, because those cities are so much larger than the third city, the smaller one. All right, so that's the gravity model. If you get a map with a bunch of circles on it of varying sizes, that's a question about gravity. Remember the old rule, larger areas are more connected to one another and closer areas are more connected. So small areas that are on the outer edges, the periphery, they're going to be the last oftentimes to receive the effect. Let's move over to, I don't know what's going on with some of these units, but whatever. Let's go on to Malthus and Esther Boserup. I think we know Malthus pretty well. He's the geographer, I guess we'll call him, the scientist, who published an essay that theorized, remember, the world's population was increasing faster than food, and that eventually the population grows exponentially. Remember, it multiplies, he said, whereas food grows at a slower arithmetic rate. He called it a linear rate. So what Malthus says is, hey, in the future, eventually we're going to have a larger population than available food supplies. That's going to lead to checks on the population, like war, like disease, like famine, until basically the population gets underneath the food supply again. Malthus is considered false just because he did not foresee a number of important innovations. He did not foresee the Industrial Revolution and the changes that occurred there with food production. And he also did not envision the Green Revolution, GMOs, fertilizers, those sorts of things, pesticides, herbicides, because he was from the 1700s and 1800s. He didn't expect these things or envision these things. He assumed food production would remain the same that it was during his life. Boy, was he wrong. The new technological innovations have skyrocketed the amount we're able to produce. Neo-Malthusians, New Malthusians as they are called, believe in zero population growth, ZPG they call it. They argue that strict controls need to be placed on countries with high fertility rates because they argue that even though Malthus may have been wrong at the time, that eventually his theories may become true. If it doesn't involve food, Neo-Malthusians argue, it'll involve other resources that'll become limited, like oil or water, things that are obviously very necessary in modern times. The counter-argument to Malthus and Neo-Malthusians is provided by Esther Boserup, and there she is. She theorized that people are going to find ways to increase food production during times of pressure. When the going gets tough, we find new ways to increase food production, maybe more intensive work in the fields, maybe through the use of machinery, maybe through fertilizers. Her point is, we always have during times of trouble, when we've been put under pressure, we've always found ways to massively increase food production. So she argues there's no reason to think we won't continue to do so in the future. A good example she uses is crop rotation, remember, where Boserup argues you can use less and less of the field. You can go from a 2-crop rotation eventually to a 3 and then a 4-crop rotation, where you're using more and more of the land to meet the needs of your population, and you're also allowing it to replenish. Boserup was known for that power of ingenuity, which means kind of invention, innovation, would always outmatch that of demand. Boserup's supporters are known as cornucopians. I'm sure we all know what a cornucopia is. And they believe that population increase is actually a good thing, that it promotes economic development. It leads to greater economic growth because you have more workers available, you have more brain power, you have more thinkers who you can use their ideas to boost your economy. Boserup is an optimist. Malthus is a pessimist. And that goes for their followers as well. All right? Let's get to some of the theories we talked about today under development. We're going to start with the world systems theory. Remember, this is Immanuel Wallerstein, and he divides the world into three groups: the core, the semi-periphery, and the core. There's an awesome map of those theories. And what Wallerstein says is, hey, in the core, countries with the highest levels of education, they're going to have the highest levels, the highest salaries, wages. They're going to have more technology. They're going to generate more wealth and be more dominant in the world economy than the rest of the world. That's why they're core. That's why they're fully industrialized. They have that advantage. They have that head start. Underneath the core are going to be the lowest countries, I guess you could say, in terms of education. They're going to have workers with the lowest salaries, or GNIs, per capita. They're going to have less technology than the rest of the world. And obviously that means they generate less wealth in the world economy. And then you're going to have the countries that are in the middle. So the core would be the U.S. The periphery would be, Tanzania. All right? And then the semi-periphery, well, those would be places where you see both core and peripheral processes taking place in the same country. There might be some regions of the country that are core, but the overwhelming remainder of the country is periphery. And they're places that are dominated on the core, by the core, but then they tend to exert power or dominate the periphery. So, like, hey, American companies might come in to, Brazil or Mexico, and they might dominate the economy there in terms of production, and a lot of the products are going to go back to the United States. However, Mexico is able to do the same thing to peripheral countries like Guatemala and Honduras. And Mexican companies often are able to take advantage of even lower wages in these countries and ship more and more products back to Mexico, especially the wealthier parts of Mexico, too. So the core takes advantage of the resources, the labor of the periphery and the semi-periphery, and the semi-periphery in the middle kind of does the same thing to the peripheral world as well. What Wallerstein is essentially saying here, since they generate the wealth and they have the highest levels of development, the innovation, the technology, they dominate the periphery through trade. Almost all of the trade goes back to the core country. So they're importing products from the periphery, whereas the periphery gets very little for themselves to use to raise their development levels. And again, the semi-periphery has both processes occurring, both core and peripheral. It gets exploited by the core, but does the same to the peripheral world. And again, those peripheral countries are really at the bottom. They usually have resources and/or a lot of workers, but they don't get to see a lot of the benefit or profits from much of that work. So again, why does Wallerstein develop this? Well, he rejects the idea there's a first, second, and third world. He argues we're all just one world and we're all completely interconnected with each other through these incredibly complex networks and this economic exchange that we just talked about. And again, these tears are not static. What I mean there is a core country can technically drop down, which is unlikely to happen, but it can. And peripheral countries can become semi-peripheral. Semi-peripheral over time can become core. And a group of countries has really dominated the core for much of the last century. Obviously, that would be the United States and Europe. That would include Japan as well. All right. So we've got the dominant core and then the more marginal or dependent periphery and semi-periphery, which are in the middle. All right, let's get to geopolitical theory. We're going to start with our old buddy Friedrich Ratzel, the man with the beard that is a thing of legend. Ratzel, remember, develops the organic theory. He argued that a country, is a lot like a biological organism that goes through stages. There's the birth stage, there's the maturity stage, there's the decline stage, and there's the death stage. In order to prolong your existence, in order to maintain your maturity and prevent your decline as a country, you needed nourishment, like any organism does. What is the nourishment that a country needs in order to grow and survive? Well, it's the territory from its neighbors. It's the territory from less powerful countries around it that it can use to continue to expand at the surrounding countries' expense. It was used by the Germans to support expansion and to acquire territory during World War I and II. Hitler declared that Germany had been overcrowded prior to World War II and that they needed living space. He called it Lebensraum. Because they had lost much of their land after World War I's defeat. And so he argued this was going to make Germany strong again. By acquiring that territory, he was channeling the ideas of Friedrich Ratzel. That takes us to Helfrid Mackinder and the Heartland. Many of his contemporaries, many of his fellow geographers, and especially his fellow British geographers, up to this point believed that sea power was the key to world domination, and because it led to you having colonies and trade around the world. Mackinder disagreed, and what he looked at was, what are the areas of the world that seem to be the toughest to conquer? And he settled on an area in Eurasia, most of Eurasia, most of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. He considered this to be the largest and the most important landmass in the world. It was research-rich, he said. It was the pivot area, which meant it was the key area by which the rest of the world really pivoted and, or I guess you could say almost revolved. And that it was impregnable, that you couldn't defeat it with a strong navy because, well, you had to have a strong land army in order to conquer and hold it. And a navy wasn't going to help you to achieve conquest because it was protected on many sides from a naval attack. And remember, the frozen ice up in the Arctic Ocean prevented naval invasions there. Anyways, Mackinder and the Heartland Theory was developed because there were fears that the Soviet Union was following the Heartland Theory and was trying to expand communism after World War II out of this area into the rest of Europe and Asia, into the rest of the world island. The counter-argument to the Heartland Theory is the Rimland Theory. This is Nicholas Spikeman. He argued, hey, it's not the heartland of the world island. It's not the heartland of Eurasia that's the key. It's actually the area that surrounds it, the Rimland, which includes all of the rest of Europe, the Middle East, and most of Asia. He argued, hey, it actually has the abundant resources you need to be a modern economy. It also has very dense populations. And more importantly, it has access not only to the sea for trade and protection, but also it technically has access into the interior as well. And a good example of the Rimland Theory on a different scale would be China. China's west coast, that borders the ocean, is super wealthy, right, and super populated. Meanwhile, its most remote areas like Tibet and the mountainous desert regions of western China, less populated, less economic development, almost like a fully developing country in sub-Saharan Africa. Anyways, these two guys really agreed with the same theory. They just disagreed what the best way to achieve world domination was. Control the heartland, control the rimland. Well, it depends whether you're Mackinder or Spikeman. Anyways, not quite sure what the whole point of this. Currently, we focus. Currently, our focus is on how we construct ideas about place and how those ideas shape foreign policy. Yeah, we can skip over this one. I don't think we need to know much about this. You do need to know after World War II, remember, the world becomes divided along two bipolar world, the United States and the Soviet Union. And it really is based on ideology. If you supported democracy and capitalism, you tended to support the U.S. If you supported communism or you criticized capitalism, you probably were more likely to support the Soviets. Because of our fears about communism expanding into the Rimland, out of the current places where it was located in the heartland. Remember, we adopted a policy in Asia known as the domino theory. We believed that when one country fell to communism, others around them would fall like dominoes too. And so we had to prevent the first one from falling, or the first few, otherwise all the others would as well. It's not an accurate theory. We now know that it's not necessarily true that just because a country falls to communism, its neighbors do too. But it resulted in the U.S. multiple times getting involved in conflicts during the Cold War to try to slow or stop the spread of communism. For instance, the Korean War, we supported South Korea, which was fighting against the communist North, and we were successful in at least protecting South Korea all the way up until today. We also had a war in Vietnam during this era, and that was over communism as well. We supported democratic South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam. Unfortunately, there we were unsuccessful, and the Vietnamese communists were able to seize control of the entire area. But hey, China falls to communism. So did Korea during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. But you know what? Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, India, they didn't. So clearly that proves the domino theory was flawed, even if it was the theory that the U.S. government used throughout most of the Cold War. Another word that we use sometimes is containment. We wanted to contain communism, which meant keep it where it was. Do not allow it to expand out of its heartland area. All of this goes back to the whole Mackinder and Spikeman debate. The U.S. obviously supports Spikeman's Rimland Theory. Let's go to agriculture, and that means we're hanging out with our buddy Von Thunen. Remember, Von Thunen is very similar to Burgess's concentric zone model. You explain where economic activities are located and why. Remember, Von Thunen was trying to analyze the character of economic activity based on his own observations. He's trying to take a look at where he lives and how agriculture is set up there. And his question is, how similar is agriculture here to the rest of the world? And so what he bases his determinations on is, one, what farmers will produce. It's based on the distance from their market, from the city center. The cost of transportation determines their use of the land. So they're going to locate based on their transportation costs mixed in with their land costs. Obviously, land costs will be more expensive towards the center. They're going to be less expensive away from the center, right? Obviously, transportation costs usually are lower if you're closer to the center, and usually more costly further away. So what Von Thunen says is you got your market, that's where all of your goods are going to be bought and sold, and so that's where all of your farmers are going to be dropping their crops off. And he said, remember, your first ring is going to be your dairy and market farming ring. Those are going to be the items that are closest to the city. They must be quickly transported. They cannot spoil because they spoil quickly. They perish quickly. Secondly, and by the way, market farming is going to be fresh fruits and vegetables along with horticulture, flowers, and then dairies as well near those markets because we know that milk does not last forever. The second ring, he said, would be timber for fire and building materials. It had to be close to the city because wood is heavy, and so transporting it would be heavy and difficult. Therefore, you got to keep it close to the city. The third ring were the field crops. Remember, he called these extensive field crops like grain. They're obviously lighter than timber, and they can last longer than fresh fruits and vegetables can. They don't perish as quickly, so that's going to be their ring. And then your last ring, he says, is going to be the fourth ring. That's going to be ranching. Why are they on the outside? Why can they afford to locate so far from the city center? Because, well, they have self-transporting animals that can walk to the city center, so they can pay the least for transportation, technically nothing. Beyond that fourth ring, remember, Von Thunen argued, you're going to eventually get so far from the market that it's just not profitable to produce really any of these particular goods. And so at that point, you're just so far away, it would be wilderness, uninhabited, unprofitable, because you're just too far from the city to make it cost effective. Why is the model obsolete? Well, remember, he makes a bunch of assumptions that we now know are less accurate today. The first is that it's an isolated state. Remember, his is based on the idea that it's basically a state on its own, separate, that there's no other markets, it has no connections with other markets or cities or states. We know that's not true. This is all before industrialization, so his theory did not take into account factories or highways or railroads or refrigeration, all of which undermine his theory in some way. Also, he assumes there are no barriers to transportation, like rivers or waterways, mountains or hills or anything like that. He assumes all transportation is occurring without barriers, and that everybody is using the same method of transportation. Remember, cart, wagon, essentially, or cart, and that there are no mountains, rivers, or other blocking terrain. Remember, he assumes the soil is the same everywhere, and we know that's not true. Obviously, there's better and worse soil qualities in different places, and obviously that would affect where farming activities locate. But obviously, he didn't take that into account. The biggest knock on von Thunen is with globalization. Obviously, we're able now to produce goods overseas and ship them back to our country again. In fact, that's what plantation farming is. And of course, he has no answer to that. So it's clearly obsolete, but at the same sense, there are some similarities with American agriculture. There are some accuracies with European agriculture. So the general ideas are true, even if the specifics might not be as accurate as they used to be, and even if we can find a ton of different exceptions to a lot of these rules. All right, let's go to central place theory. Obviously, I think this is so vitally important because this is my most likely, one of my most likely FRQ questions. Okay, central place is every settlement that provides their population and their surrounding area goods and services is its own central place. Every settlement, from the smallest hamlet and village to the largest megacities in the world, megalopolises, all of them are central places that offer goods and services to their people and to the surrounding area. And remember, the extent of their goods and services is known as their hinterland, right, or market area. That's the furthest extent that their goods and services are used. And so Walter Christaller is really the man who's responsible for this. He's a geographer who studied towns in Germany. He noticed that towns of certain sizes seem to be kind of roughly equidistant from one another, which means they are spread out in a pattern in a way where similar-sized cities seem to be evenly spaced out. Obviously, he was wondering, all right, is this the case in other places as well? Let me develop a theory based on this and then test it out. And so the key concept of his theory, remember, he says every market area, every settlement, every city is going to have a threshold for their products. The threshold is the minimum market number of people needed to keep a central place in business. Even a business has a threshold. What's the minimum number needed to keep a place in business? And then the range was the distance people were willing to travel to use the goods and services, either in your central place or specifically provided by one of the businesses in your central place. Low order goods, remember, he said, are products that are replenished quickly and that they're food, other routine household items like paper goods and toiletries. People buy these frequently, and because they're considered common everyday items, people will buy them at the closest locations instead of going into the city because they're readily available in almost all central places. Higher order goods are specialized items like cars, furniture, jewelry, appliances. They're bought less often, and they require a larger threshold because of that. What that means is they're often located in cities that serve a larger surrounding market area, a larger surrounding hinterland, because they need a larger threshold in order to survive, since people are going to frequent their stores less often. Anyways, the central place theory from Christaller, it explains the location, the size, and the number of settlements in an urban area or an urban system. It's based on what goods and services are provided by each of the central places, their hinterland, which is the maximum extent people will travel into their, or I should say the maximum extent that their market area provides goods and services. It's obviously bigger in larger cities with more services and goods provided. It's obviously a smaller market area or hinterland. if it is a smaller settlement with fewer goods and services. Remember, in this instance, C stands for city, T for town, V for village, H for hamlet. So the city is going to have the biggest market area, and you'll notice the city is also going to offer the same low-order goods that smaller central places do. So in those instances, it's going to compete with them for the smaller, lower-order goods to try to attract people to come to theirs instead of to some of the others provided by smaller settlements. But for your larger order goods or your higher order goods, they're going to have this much larger market area because obviously people are going to be willing to travel more into the city to take advantage of its unique goods and services. Please remember that in central place theory, we use hexagons. Why? Because each central place has its own market area and hinterland that it controls, that the people shop from in its central place, or travel to in order to use its central place. The problem is if we use the circle shape to describe the market area around a city, there's places on our map that are underserved. They don't belong technically to a market area, or their market areas overlap with one another. In theory, these people are going to one of these central places in order to shop. And so we decided to use the hexagon to avoid overlap, to avoid gaps in central places. So we use the hexagon because obviously it's similar to a circle, and there's no area in the hexagon that's particularly too much further away than any other area. When we're determining market areas, we use those hexagons. Assumptions of central place. Hey, again, he assumes it's a flat area with no barriers. He assumes the population in our urban structure is pretty evenly spread out. He assumes resources are evenly spread out. He assumes we have equal transportation networks throughout our urban structure. He assumes all consumers basically have the same purchasing power, which basically means they have the same ability to buy goods that they need. And he always, and this is the biggest, he assumes that all consumers will always go to the nearest market. We know that's just not the case for a variety of reasons. People may skip over the closest market and choose to go to a further one, which would devalue his theory. All right. Let's get to American cities, and we're going to start with those North American cities and geographers here. First off, modern cities are way more complex than they used to be. And urban geographers have constructed these models to try to explain the layout of American cities based on the way that the land is used. And of course, we got to start with the classical models, and then we'll follow it up with the modern models. All right, classical models first, and that means we got to start with Burgess and the concentric zone. This is the easiest one. Ernst Burgess, 1920s, based his model on Chicago. It's a city, he said, that grew in a series of rings surrounding the CBD. You have your central business district with most of the retail business and even industry located there. You're going to have a zone of transition. This is going to be older inner-city neighborhoods, usually frequented by low-income workers. Generally speaking, maybe a lot of apartments and condos, high density, probably a lot of migrants or new arrivals to the city who are taking advantage of the low-cost housing. Surrounding that, you're going to get independent workers' homes. These would generally be what we would describe kind of as lower-class homes, probably. Lower middle class. These are independent workers. They can afford to live a little further from the CBD because they can afford to transport themselves more so than folks that live in the transition zone. Then we are going to have our zones of better residences. This would be middle-class homes in the surrounding zone. And then, of course, on the outer edge, right, you're going to get that commuter zone. Those are the folks that live in the earliest suburbs. They're going to self-transport themselves. Well, not self-transport. They'll transport with horse and buggy, maybe some early railroad or streetcar systems. So, Ernst Burgess says the CBD is where people work, shop, and go for entertainment. The zone of transition is low-class housing, usually a lot of immigrants mixed in with an industrial zone with a lot of manufacturer factories. And that's why the low-class locate there, to be close to those factory jobs that attracted them to the city in the first place. Blue-collar workers are going to be housed in the next ring. That's what we generally refer to kind of as lower or lower middle-class homes. Then you're going to get the white-collar middle-class homes on the next ring outward. And finally, you're going to get that suburban ring of commuters made up of high-class homes that slowly stretch into the countryside. These folks are horse and buggy in it, maybe taking advantage of early streetcars or subway systems to get themselves into that vital hustle and bustling CBD. Homer Hoyt criticizes Burgess's model. He described it as too simplistic, too inaccurate, that there were too many cities that didn't reflect the concentric zone model. And so what he says is, hey, I think growth from the CBD outward doesn't occur in a series of rings. It rather occurs in a series of wedges or corridors that almost look like pieces of a pie that extend outward from the CBD. First off, he says, the high-class residential neighborhoods generally don't change very much over time, but let's take a quick look at Homer Hoyt's theory. First off, we start in the center with the CBD. We always do. All right, so that's still going to have your shops, your offices, your banks, your stock markets, your entertainment areas as well. That's really still the center of the classical city. Then you're going to get lower class homes in a sector that borders the CBD. It's listed as number, where is it here? 3 on our map, low rent and residential. You see how it bumps up, these 2 low rent sectors bump up against the CBD. That makes sense because those folks are going to need to get into the industrial zones of the CBD to take advantage of their jobs. Why does it form in this pie-like sector, this wedge form? Well, Hoyt says it has a lot to do with transportation corridors. We're going to start to see transportation like railroads start to be built for the first time, or maybe even streetcar or subways. And where railroads are built from the CBD, they extend outward towards the outer edges of the city, and you're going to start to see sectors of housing pop up around those corridors, around those transportation routes, like the railroads. Then what you notice here is you're also going to get middle-class homes that are going to kind of border the CBD and the low-class homes. Again, these are going to generally be what we would describe as kind of middle-class housing. Then you're going to get high-rent residential. It's going to be as far as possible from the low-class and the industrial wedge that sticks outward from the CBD as well, because you will have a transportation wedge, you will have an industrial wedge. The highest rent and land values tend to locate the furthest from the industry, where most of the pollution and overcrowding is taking place, and they'll have their direct access into the CBD, maybe through a streetcar or subway system. All right, so wedges as opposed to the zones. Why do those wedges form? Well, usually related to transportation innovations. All right, that takes us to the multiple nuclei model, which I'm apparently jumping over. All right, good Lord, what is Mr. M doing? There he is. The multiple nuclei model is this. It's developed by a guy named Chauncey Harris and Edward Ullman. It's developed in the 40s, so if you're keeping score at home, Burgess in the 20s, Hoyt in the 30s, Ullman in the 40s. They argued neither of the two models were accurate that came before them. They really view the city as a collection of individual centers. There is a CBD, the traditional central business district, but there's actually a number of smaller individual, like mini CBDs that are going to pop up and form along the city. And that the city really develops multiple nodes of activity. And so over time, your CBD is going to become, I guess you could say, less valuable, less important than it was in the past. It exists, it just doesn't dominate like the nucleus of the urban area like it does in the other models. Instead, as low, middle, and especially higher class residences start to form, low will be closest to the CBD still. Middle will kind of be like, well, to be honest with you, still connected to the CBD, but oftentimes in the middle of between the low and the high class zones. You are going to get those high-class suburban neighborhoods towards the outside. And here's the big thing. As you get those high-class homes that start to pop up and those high-class neighborhoods that start to pop up, you're going to start to see transportation centers, healthcare centers, education centers, industrial centers, business or retail centers begin to pop up towards the outer edges of the city. They're catering towards the neighborhoods on the outer edge, especially, for instance, like retail suburbs, like shopping malls, and retail facilities or entertainment complexes. All of these are going to basically almost become like their own nodes, their own centers of activity, like mini CBDs throughout the city. So your city has become much less decentralized, it's become much less centralized, and is much more decentralized than it was before. Much more kind of spread out, where you have activity going on in multiple nodes at the same time. Your CBD is losing that value. This is really starting to take into account automobiles by the 40s, and in particular automobile suburbs, right, where peeps lived in the suburbs and still were able to drive their cars throughout the rest of the city. Now we're starting to see business and industry actually relocate from the CBD towards those outer suburb areas. All right. Now we get to our modern models as the CBD becomes less and less and less important each time. All right, so let's get to peripheral galactic model. This is Chauncey Harris again. This is his extension or update to the old multiple nuclei. The peripheral galactic city model, remember, argued that the urban area does still have that central city, and it has that huge suburban area and the shopping malls, the office parks, the industrial areas, the service complexes. All of those, he says, form towards the outer edges of the city, just like they did with multiple nuclei, and they're going to be connected by some sort of ring road or beltway, some sort of freeway system that encircles the city and that connects all of these new nuclei, these new nodes that have popped up in order to service the outer suburb communities. Anyways, remember the ring road, remember the beltway as it's called, and you'll do fine with the galactic city, also known as the peripheral model. You're going to nail that. Urban realms, remember James Vance, he really studied San Francisco, and he argues, hey, cities aren't really linked. What happens is cities basically create a region that's completely linked together. These regions or these cities within the region cooperate and connect and trade and have relations with each other, but they're all still able to function independently and separately from one another if they have to as well. So again, you've got a central city and you have a bunch of built-up suburbs, fully developed suburbs. He refers to them as edge cities. These are not just residential suburbs that are still relying on the CBD. They've gotten to the point where each of these suburbs is so self-sufficient, it's like its own separate city, but since all of their boundaries overlap, it's essentially one megalopolis of various original central city surrounded by a bunch of edge cities like balloons. Again, a lot of coordination, a lot of cohesion between the various cities, but they can also all function independently, separately, and provide the services for the people in their area. He describes this massive megalopolis, this aggregation or this combination of urban areas that just bump up and overlap with each other. He called it a conurbation, remember. That is where your urban area basically is almost non-ending. In an area, it usually is known more commonly as a megalopolis. Edge cities, very recent, Joel Garrow. It's another spatial model for cities. Cities that are located on the outer edges of a large city, they serve a lot of the same functions, but they do so in kind of a sprawling suburban environment. It's a concentration of economic activity, like business, shopping, entertainment, that you wouldn't normally expect in a traditional urban area. Here's the key thing with an edge city. They have tons of office and retail space. So you're going to see a lot of office buildings, a lot of space that's available for new stores or retail businesses to open up. Modern buildings oftentimes are dominated by tech firms, technology firms, and service industries. So again, you're seeing your edge cities on the outside in the urban realms model. now start to concentrate business, shopping, and entertainment into certain regions or neighborhoods of the edge city. Again, it's just further devaluing the CBD because many of the CBD functions are now located on the edge of the central city in these new edge city areas. He said, remember that there will be suburban sectors. They're often located near freeway entrances or intersections. Those are going to have a lot of office complexes. They're going to have a lot of shopping centers, hotels, restaurants, entertainment facilities, maybe a sports complex. These edge cities are not, they're sometimes known as kind of like bedroom communities, even though they're not just residences. They offer all of these functions away from the traditional CBD that would have originally probably located there. All right, Southern California is a really good example of a CBD of an edge city, an urban realms model. If downtown LA was the CBD, then we could divide up the various regions of Los Angeles and Southern California into independent realms which are dependent on each other for trade and interaction, but can still function independently if they need to. For instance, Orange County obviously does a lot of trade with Riverside and LA County, but obviously we're not fully dependent on them in that we can function without them in terms of producing products. Again, urban realms model and edge city are incredibly similar. In reality, what's happening here is the urban realms model creates the idea of edge cities, which turn essentially over time into their own mini CBDs. All right. Foreign cities, we'll start with Southeast Asia. That means we're going to the McGee model, that there's no formal CBD, remember. Why? Well, because usually central business functions in a Southeast Asian city are scattered. They're spread out. You're going to find a Western commercial zone, right? That's going to be zones for Western merchants like core countries in the United States and Europe to establish factories. Then you're going to have an alien commercial zone. That's going to be mostly the Asian countries' merchants or Asian country merchants. Of course, those are generally going to be connected to a port because most of those goods are going to be exported back to home countries. Residential areas tend to get poorer the further you are from the port region. Remember, Asia is really the only place that copies the U.S. tradition of, well, cities being located, poorer classes being located towards the outer edges of the city. You're also going to have, uniquely enough, so again, you have your port area with all of your manufacturing and industry. You're going to have your middle class zone. Then you're going to have your newest zones that are also going to be spread with some squatter settlements because pretty much all of the developing world has squatter settlements. And then there's going to be a market gardening ring towards the outer area that is going to provide fresh fruits and vegetables to the population of that area. You're also going to oftentimes see a new industrial park. We don't mean like a park where you play in. We mean like a strip mall or massive strip malls that provide, obviously, industry, buildings, and or retail services if necessary to the public. The African city model, remember, there is really no single model. So this is really kind of a mixture of different models, I guess you could say. Remember, you're going to have 3 CBDs. That's the dead giveaway. You got the old colonial CBD. That's going to have the grid-like pattern, right? The squares, the plazas that colonial countries oftentimes established. You'll then have your traditional CBD, right? Those are usually single-story buildings, traditional architecture. That would normally be the CBD of today, I guess you could say. It's the most recent of the 3. Then you're going to have a market zone. The market's going to be open air. It's going to generally be informal, which means, this is transactions being done under the table, outside of being taxed. This can be done by curbside. It's done in stalls. All transactions are public. There's one exception to the African city model. That would be South Africa. Because it was so heavily English and then Dutch, it really follows the European city model format. Okay? And I think I described each of these, yep. Residences, again, poorer, away from the CBD. Remember, what we notice with African cities is people do not mix by social class, they mix by tribe, by race and ethnicity. So you're going to have ethnic neighborhoods surrounded by more mixed neighborhoods. Then towards the outside, you're going to find those squatter settlements known as informal satellite townships. All right? There may be a mining or manufacturing zone towards the outside as well. Most of the time, the mining and manufacturing operations are being run by companies from core countries that are using their technology to extract the African resource. The Latin American city model developed by dudes named Griffin and Ford. Again, this really talks a lot about the significance of the squatter settlements. It's known as the Periférico, if you remember, by these two gentlemen. Okay, so we start with the CBD. Obviously, that's traditional, right? Like other CBDs elsewhere. It's going to have the retail, it's going to have the restaurants, it's going to have the parks and the entertainment. Then you're going to have a market. Again, it's going to be usually open air. It's going to be some sort of informal economy, an informal market, a farmer's market, or a bazaar. Then it starts to get interesting. We're going to have some sort of what they call industrial or retail spine that extends outward from the CBD towards usually malls, retail malls towards the outer edges of the city. Around that spine that has all the retail, has all the new businesses, you're going to get what becomes known as your elite zone. All right, that's the gray on this. That's your super wealthy, exclusive communities, maybe gated communities that are completely separate from the rest of the city itself, that provide their own direct access into the CBD. Then, around the CBD, where the spine and the wealthy folks aren't located, you're actually going to find a lot of what is called the zone of maturity, which is kind of stable housing. You're probably going to find a gentrified zone there as well, which is an inner city neighborhood that's being rebuilt. Obviously, the purple on this map, kind of in between the Periférico and the CBD, is your what is known as your accretion zone. That's going to be modest housing. Maybe a little bit of poverty there. Then as you get further from the city, right, you get to the Periférico, that's where you are going to be finding your squatter settlements, your slums, barrios in most Spanish-speaking countries, favelas in Brazil. You get unskilled, you get impoverished, recent arrivals living in these shanty towns, these slums. And then, please notice, you get the zones of disamenity. These disamenity zones connect the market and CBD to the rest of the periphery. They're inhabited by folks that would normally live in the periphery, but these are especially important zones because it's the only way that the rest of the periphery has access into the city, the CBD and the market. All right? These, what are called disamenity zones, are usually slums, where gangs dominate, drug lords dominate, because they can have a lot of control over the movement of people and goods into the center of the city and out. So again, let's remember with Latin American cities, the wealthy cluster to around the city itself for the most part, alrighty, in that gentrified area and in those stable housing zones. Then you're going to have that elite sector that surrounds the spine of the city, the retail spine, the business spine. Then you're going to have kind of what we would probably describe as modest housing, lower class housing. And then finally, out towards the outside, you have the lowest of it all. You have those squatter settlements that exist. So wealthy, I would say upper middle class or middle class, lower class in the purple, and then the lowest social classes and new arrivals in the Periférico and the disamenity zones. Again, do you notice how the wealthy tend to locate exactly opposite of where the industrial businesses are, where the factories are that are going to be employing the workers? And a lot of times that means more noise, more pollution, more overcrowding, and so the wealthy elites tend to locate as far away from that as they can. Development models, I covered some of these today in class, and I even mentioned, I think, Rostow and Wallerstein already. What the heck? Anyways, remember, these two guys basically disagree with each other completely. Wallerstein supports, that dependency theory, or that world systems theory, which is really a dependency theory. They call those the structuralist models, people who believe there is a structure between the core and the peripheral world. The liberal model, the more optimistic view of development, is the term we use to describe Rostow. He called it his modernization model, but it's normally just known as Rostow's development model. All right, again, the structuralist dependency theory. The dependency theory argued, hey, during colonialism, certain political and economic structures were created by the colonizers to try to force that colony to become dependent on them. And this started during the Industrial Revolution because Europe needed those supplies, those resources in order to keep industrializing. And so they acquired these territories, they took them over, they conquered them, so that they had the resources they need to continue this process. What happens, the dependency theory people argue, is this dependency helps to sustain the colonized country, or at least a portion of the country, that there are certain leaders, there are certain, maybe a city or a region within the city that can be very wealthy by basically providing the services to the colonizers that they need, even though that means the rest of the country or the rest of the region can be much more impoverished. So again, we know why Europeans colonized the world, for the resources, and oftentimes what happened is they actually worked with parts of the countries they took over, and those areas became much wealthier than the rest of the colonized area. All right, so dependency theorists argue that colonization created these connections between the two, and there was obviously, there's this fully industrialized civilization. It has a Christian background. It has this consumer market economy that we call it, with international trade. Life goes around rapidly. At a breakneck speed with all the innovations and technological wonders. Meanwhile, you have many of these colonies, dependency theorists would argue, that don't have machines, that do not have a currency, that still use barter trade, like cheese for goats, and a slow rhythm of life. And so there was the belief that colonization created the domination of the smaller colonized minority group. I should say the dominant group, the colonizer, would send over small groups of people. They would be a minority in the country, but they would establish policies that asserted their racial superiority, their cultural superiority, and more importantly, they maintained so much wealth compared to their colonized people that they had huge material advantages, like guns over spears, all right? Plows instead of working by hand. So there's the dependency theory, right? Imperialism occurred. European countries, look at France, all the purple around the world, right? Look at England, all of the pink around the world, right? Look at the United States. Oh, look at us. We got part of Alaska. We got parts of South America, or Central America, I should say, as well. Look at us. We have the Philippines. So the point here is those European countries acquire all of these territories in order to use the resources of these places. And you will notice how many of these European countries, and I'm going to include the U.S., I'm going to include Japan, so how many of these core countries imperialized? Pretty much all of them did. Some had more success than others because some started earlier than others. Anyways, Rostow's model, very different. So anyways, the structuralists, these dependency theorists, they essentially argue that even up till today, even though these countries are now independent, that neocolonialism has occurred where they're still completely economically subservient to the country that used to colonize them. All right. Counter to that again is Rostow. Remember, we already talked about Rostow, I think we did. Hold on, let me double check to see if we did talk about Rostow. Okay, shoot, I guess we didn't. I did today at the review, but that's a different story. Walt W. Rostow in the 60s proposes his response, I guess you could say, to the dependency theory. He proposed, hey, there are 5 steps that every country goes through as they develop. All countries follow this similar path to development, he argues. They all go through these 5 stages, even if they do so at their own speed, at their own rate, at their own time. Rostow, remember, argued that that the first step for all societies was traditional. You're a subsistence farming society. You haven't industrialized at all yet. That means life is hard for your society. You don't have any of the major improvements or innovations that a developed country would. Then he says you start to prepare your country to industrialize. Usually, you need very progressive leaders. You need new leaders that take over and push industrialization and modernization in your country. They really make it a mission or a goal to achieve as quickly as possible. They also start to diversify the economy. What that means is they start to try to develop new industries so that most of your money is not just coming from one source, it's being more evenly spread out. Stage 3 is takeoff. That's when you start to see the breakthroughs in industrialization. That's where you start to urbanize. You start to see new machines, new technology for the first time. You're going to see, for instance, in the textile industry maybe is where it'll start, like it did in England and the United States. It doesn't affect all industries. Some benefit from these new machines and innovations, others do not. Stage 4, we go to the drive to maturity. That's where now your innovations have spread throughout all of your industries. You are starting to embrace the international trade model. You start to specialize your production. You determine what you can specialize in and produce at an advantage over the rest of the world. And that's what you're going to focus on from this point forward. Stage 5 is only for the highest economies, the service economies, the most developed. These are called the age of mass consumption. This is the high incomes, post-industrial. You're making mostly consumer goods as opposed to stage 4 when you were making heavy industrial goods. Most of your jobs are now service sector or higher. Again, the way I like to look at it is this is the plane of development. Stage 1, that thing hasn't even taken off yet. It's not even moving. Stage 2, it's taxiing on the runway, getting ready for industrialization. Stage 3, takeoff. We've industrialized, but only just barely getting off the ground and only in a few industries. Stage 4, drive to maturity. Our plane has gotten to its elevation, and now it's cruising as more and more is produced. And then stage 5, that is where you are at kind of the cruising height. You're at your perfect height, your peak height, and you are powering through faster than ever before, producing consumer goods, and your overall quality of life and economic development is high. It's a core country level. So again, if we were using countries around the world as an example, their takeoff stage in England happened about 1800. Its drive to maturity about the mid-1800s. And then its high mass consumer economy really merges after World War II in the 1940s. Let's take a look at the good old US of A. We did not start our takeoff stage until about the 1860s, Civil War time. Then we didn't really achieve maturity until the late the early 1900s. That's when we started to, that's when we were producing cars and railroads and steel, things like that. And then after the World Wars, really after World War I, but especially after World War II, that's when we move into that high mass consumption economy. Do you notice England is the first to industrialize by far? Look at when they start compared to everybody else. But do you notice the U.S. is the first to achieve high mass consumption levels? All right? That's kind of a unique thing. We start later, but we industrialize much more quickly than other countries do. Hey, do you notice also, taking a look here, Look at some of these countries that have really just started to take off since World War II. Most of the developing world, that's the case. For instance, Mexico, right, is just in its takeoff stage at the time that the United States has already been in mass consumption. That would help to explain why the U.S. has so many wealth advantages, power over how it dominates Mexico and the rest of the Western Hemisphere, because it's the economic powerhouse of that area. Let's take a look at what do we have here. Here we go. Stages of progress. Your lowest is your traditional stage. Then you're going to start to get into stage 2. Those are preconditions for takeoff, right? Then you're into takeoff mode. Now we're going up to our cruising altitude, and there we've achieved highest production, a modern, post-industrial modern economy. Go us, all right? The U.S. Started in the past, right? Obviously, we have achieved from stage 1 to stage 5. It took us, about 100 years to do so, all right? Meanwhile, a country like Chad in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, it starts its industrialization much later. As a result, because it's a peripheral country, it is still industrializing. It's in stage 2 today. All right. Again, the dependency theory, the structuralist theory, it argues that economic differences that exist between MDCs and LDCs are the result of historical relations between the two that really cannot be changed easily, that it goes back to colonialism, and the same kind of basic relationship of colonialism still exists today. A lot of these guys call it neo-colonialism. They believe that dependency theorists believe it's really misleading to follow Rostow's model, because he assumes obviously that all countries are going to develop at the same process, the same rate of development, and obviously we know that's not true. Rostow's model is much more positive, I think you could say. It really focuses on positive things, and basically says, hey, the differences between MDCs and LDCs are short-term. They're minor. Eventually, the LDCs are going to make it to MDC's level. If they just follow the path that the MDCs have established, they too can achieve MDC status. They assume that all countries develop in the same way. We know that's not the case. Some countries, it appears, have skipped some of these steps, especially some of those emerging economies in Southeast Asia, like the Tigers, like Taiwan and South Korea, and Hong Kong, originally like Japan, and then eventually like those other tigers as well. All right. Let's get to industrial location. We're almost finished here, thankfully. This one's going forever. Alfred Weber, talked about him today in class, or I should say at the review. Weber has what is known as the least cost theory. This is for manufacturing industry. It's for secondary jobs or secondary activity. What he says is, hey, factories locate according to transportation costs, right? They're going to locate near the raw materials. If they are a bulk reducing industry, they'll locate near the market if they're a bulk gaining. Why? They're going to locate closer to one of these two sources if their cost of transportation is higher at that end of the production process. So, for instance, profit's the goal. Profit's always the motive, and the goal is to minimize your costs, right? And the basic rule works here, the friction of cost. That the further distance you are away, the more cost it is to transport your good. So determine the lowest cost. You use 3 factors to determine where to locate your industry, your factory. The first, the most important, is transportation. The lowest cost of getting your raw materials to the factory and or your finished product to the market. That's the number one priority, he says, in what determines where industry locates. Secondly, he says, is labor. Labor costs also matter. Worker salaries, their wages matter. And you want to try to keep them as low as possible. And then he says, hey, the third factor that industry considers when they decide where to locate is agglomeration, that factories tend to cluster in the same area to allow them to share, first off, support services like hospitals, roads, schools, that their workers can benefit from. Also to share facilities like construction or repair facilities, maybe warehouses, maybe equipment or supply facilities. And also talent, workers. If you need skilled workers, then it probably makes sense to locate where other competing businesses are located because obviously those people have located in that area in order to take advantage of that talent. So there's no reason to think you should not do the same. We need to make sure we understand this whole bulk gaining and bulk reducing. It's kind of important. Remember, if your product gains weight after you put the final product together, if it's more than what it was before from just the raw materials, then you are a bulk gaining industry, and you're going to weigh more after your product is produced than any other time before. So hey, let's say you're making cars. You're going to have all of the pieces, the parts assembled at smaller factories, and then you're going to ship all of them over to the assembly plant. And so when you're finished putting all that together, your car is going to be the heaviest that it's ever been throughout the entire process. That means it's going to be higher cost to transport them because it weighs the most that it has at any point in the production process. Therefore, it makes sense for you to locate close to the market to reduce that transportation cost when your product is heaviest. Let's say you're a bulk reducing industry. That would mean, for instance, that you're bringing in giant logs and you're carving things like, I don't know, toothpicks out of them or furniture out of them. Obviously, that means you're going to spend more cost on transporting the raw material, the log, because that's heavier than the finished product. And in that instance, you want to locate closer to the resource, to the wood, to the forest. All right? Anyways, bid rent theory applies not only to secondary but also to tertiary. The bid rent is very similar to Weber. It's the price of demand for real estate changes the further you get from the CBD. Land users compete with one another for land close to the CBD in order to maximize profits. Why? Because the CBD offers the greatest accessibility to customers, to shipping routes. It offers the highest chance for profit. And so therefore, landowners are going to compete more for that land because they view it as their best bet towards profits. Obviously, the further you get from the CBD, generally speaking, the less valuable or the less competition you'll see for that land. So for instance, in the area that's closest to the CBD, you're going to have retail and manufacturing and residential compete against each other for those spots. Usually retail is willing to spend more to be located closer to the CBD, so they'll probably take up most of those early locations. Then you're left with manufacturing and residential. Usually manufacturing is going to outbid residential, and so they'll be located in the next areas of your city. And then finally, towards the outer edges, residential. You need more land anyways for those, and people prefer to live towards those outer edges for other reasons as well. Let's not forget about Hotelling's locational interdependence, right? Locational interdependence. Hotelling argues this is only for services, tertiary activities only, he says. Services try to identify the very best location for their product, the place that they think generates the greatest profit, and what they will then try to do is locate where they can get the most customers, and then what happens is other businesses that locate, rivals, competitors, will locate, and they'll try to locate as close as possible to their rivals that are already in business so that they can split the customers in half as much as possible. All right, so remember the example on the beach of the two ice cream carts. Remember, they originally set up here. By the end of a few days, they had both backed up to each other here so that each of them could get a greater share of the customers on the beach. All right, rather than only having these customers for himself and having to split all the customers in here with A, right, with this guy, if this dude moves here, he's going to get all these customers, right? And then he only has to split that little bit with the other guy. All right, so that's why we see businesses bump up against one another. That's why we see fast food restaurants right next to each other, and coffee shops, and hotels and motels, for instance, all for the same reason. All right. Finally, August Loesch and his zones of profitability. He argues, hey, that businesses always seek out to maximize profits. And what they do is there's not just a single point where they can locate, but there's actually a zone, a series of places that they can locate where their income is going to be higher than cost. So in this model right here, this zone, this area, any of the places they locate here would be suitable, would be fine. Because in all of these places, their income would outweigh their costs. So they're making a profit by being located here. If they located too close to the CBD, the cost of that land would be so high that company probably would not be able to make a profit. If they locate too far away, they can't generate enough income because now they're too far away from the customers that use them. So ultimately, Loesch's point here is each company has its own zone of profitability where it's able to pick any one of the spots in that zone as its primary place where it should locate. And each company needs to develop their zone of profitability to know where it would be too close to locate to the CBD and where it would be too far to locate from the CBD and their potential customers. Anyways, as we're looking at all these location theories, let's remember, when it comes to manufacturing and industry, Weber is talking about manufacturing. They're going to locate where their costs are lowest. It's cost minimization, especially transportation costs. The bid-rent theory says, hey, land users are going to compete for the land closest to the CBD because they're all about maximizing profits, not about minimizing costs. Hotelling's theory argues that you identify a point that generates the greatest profit for you. And Loesch argues, no, there's not a single point of profitability, but a zone that will allow you to locate in anywhere in and still maintain those positive profits. All right. Oh, let's go to site and situation. As we wrap this baby up, I think we know site, it's the physical qualities of a place. They are not generally subject to change. If you live in a valley, you live in a valley. That valley's not going away. If you live on the coast, you live on the coast. It's not changing. Plateaus, islands, landlocked. Paris, France is located on the Seine River. That is a site, right? That's a site location. Bangkok, Thailand, located on a floodplain, right? An area that is susceptible to floods on a regular basis. That's not so good, all right? Your situation is relative to other positions or relative to what's near you. That can be subject to change, right? If you're near transportation routes or recreational areas or educational areas, do you see the difference here? It's not physical sites. These are generally man-made sites in which you are located. It helps to explain the growth and success of a city, right? Singapore is near commerce and trade. Shenzhen, China is near commerce and trade. Paris is near major transportation routes. Chicago is near the convergence of all major transportation, especially rail lines in this country. You know, the Silicon Valley is near Berkeley and Stanford. And so it is a technopole that is located near the cities where those colleges are located. Situation can reflect bad things as well. Detroit is located in the Rust Belt, right? And it has a lot of abandoned car factories, right? So you could say, hey, the position of this place is relative to abandoned factories in the area. Whoops, what did I just do? Pittsburgh, another good example of that. All right. And finally, the political structure of states. Oh, states. Some are unitary. That means the central government has most of the power. It's a highly centralized, where the central government makes most decisions. Originally, it evolved in Europe with nation states where the king or the monarch had a lot of control. We hadn't really seen democracy develop in many of these countries yet, since kings and queens were in power. There really was no regional authority. Cities, counties, provinces, they didn't really have a lot of control. Decisions were made by the central government. That's the UK, France, Chile, Mongolia. Federal states, those are, more of a mix of the central government and local governments working together. It's federal, which means the central, and then the state or the city governments kind of sharing power. It evolved with colonization. It evolved with the United States and other countries embracing decolonization, declaring independence, and wanting a system that better represented all people. Local government is given greater power, greater authority, even though the central government still usually has a majority of the power, it is at least still shared. Love the map at the bottom here. Notice the unitary states tend to dominate in a lot of the less developed world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, but that's not always the case. All right. Anyways, folks, that is it. I hope this helps. An hour and 30 minutes of model time. A lot of models. I really, really hope you study hard. It's been such a pleasure being your teacher this year, and I do hope this helps you along with everything else.